a lady called and spoke to one of us, and she said, I am in my 80s and I've always wanted a highboy. And she said, I like the one that you have on your website. Can you tell me about it? And we did. And after several phone calls and pictures back and forth, she said, I'm in my 80s. I don't have a whole lot of time left to own my highboy. And my husband said, by damn it, it's already time. You should buy it. And she did. And she got to use it for a little less than 10 years. And we recently reacquired it. That's a pretty good story, really, I think. And so she loved the idea that she knew who the people looked like, who owned it. She loved the legs on this highboy, which we'll get into in a little while. But that's a little bit of how we find these things.
Yep. And just a little bit about Martin Kellogg and Hannah Robbins Kellogg. And it's possible that that silver-hilted sword was owned by Martin Kellogg, who was born in 1746. Although his father was Captain Martin Kellogg, who was born in 1718. Both of them were from Newington. And Captain Martin Kellogg was a very active leader during the French and Indian War era of the 1740s and 1760s. And of course, that brought about a lot of status and notoriety in the community and a certain amount of wealth through those connections that you could make through military service, especially at the officer level. During the Revolutionary War, Martin Kellogg, who's in the silhouette, was a leader in the community in Newington and was actually responsible for taking the 1776 census in Newington that was used to raise funds under the direction of the Continental Congress. So that 1776 census is an important piece of Connecticut history and helps us identify those early families living in Newington, which started off as a parish or a part of Wethersfield. And so that connection to Wethersfield and the center of cabinet making in Wethersfield is really important.
So I think what we're going to do is we're going to start with the Belden Kellogg because it's a really classic example of what is known as the Wethersfield School of Cabinet Making, the Connecticut Valley. And Wethersfield was in our feeling of the Queen Anne period in Connecticut. So maybe we can sort of get a close-up of the fan, or we can bring the fan to you. And you can get a pretty good idea of how crisp, and that's why it's called a fan. I mean, it really looks like a fan, and how they imitated the design. And then we look at the dovetails, and from what we spoke to last week about the secondary wood, and in Connecticut, there was still an abundance of wood. The draw sides, everything is built well with extra thick wood, because the original cabinet makers were really bowled over by the amount of wood, the quality of the wood. And in this particular case, there's a mixture of tulip poplar and eastern white pine, but most of it is tulip poplar, and that's really great wood to use for secondary wood. So I just thought of something that as we go into the highboy, look at those legs. I mean, those are really stylish and really amazingly sort of graceful. It reminds me of an exhibition that the Historic Deerfield had, about 5 years ago, Out of the Woods. And one of the things that they showed, which I thought was absolutely brilliant, they actually had one of their cabinet makers make a replica of a Queen Anne leg. As Kevin and I can show you, the leg actually is one piece of wood. It starts right up here at the very top, right under the molding, waste molding. And it is one piece of wood all the way down to the bottom of the foot. And it started with probably the original piece of wood about 4 by 4 inches. And the first thing they would do is they would square it off. And the first thing, they would turn the very bottom part of the foot. That is the turned part. The rest of it is pretty much carved. So they have this piece of wood, it's turned at the bottom, and then if you set it aside here, you could actually look right down from the center point, and you could actually see where the foot goes right up through the center of the block. And it's a pretty remarkable engineering feat to be able to make that curve, but still have the stability and the strength to hold a 4, 5 drawer, 6 drawer, in some cases, top. In this particular case, the Boston one, this is 3 drawers, 2 split drawers, and so that's basically exactly the same way. And so that leg is holding a lot of strength. So in historic Deerfield, they made an absolute reproduction of a Queen Anne leg, and then they put it into a vise with equal pressure on the very top of the leg, right here, and at the very bottom of the leg, and they put this vise, this leg into the vise, and little by little, they pulled up the pressure to see how much pressure the leg would take before it snapped. So, you know, we can give you lots of time to think about it. How much do you think that leg would take before it cracked, before it split? Now, you have to think, this is native wood, and this particular wood is cherry. Cherry is not the most hardwood. Maple or birch would be, but cherry is a beautiful wood. So did they sacrifice anything by putting it into a vise? Well, eventually it did snap. We all knew they were going to. So each leg took the pressure of 1,600 pounds before it snapped. Think of 1,600 times 4. 6,400 pounds of pressure that highboy could hold. That's a lot of sweaters. That's a lot of socks. It's a lot of underwear. And so when you think about people saying, well, what, if I bought that, could I put my clothes into it? This highboy is about 1760, 1750 maybe. And so how many generations? The generation is 25 years. How many people use this highboy? How much clothes, storage, and utilitarian reasons that this highboy went through so many generations? They're remarkable, really. And so I think of that often when people say, wow, those legs are so voluptuous. Can they really hold? And that's the truth.
And as we, Arthur's talking about the curve of the leg and that great elegance that Wethersfield highboys have, and that execution of the Queen Anne leg that is really a hallmark of Wethersfield Queen Anne highboys. The design and the basis of the Queen Anne design came from the C-scroll, and it was this use of C-scroll and interlocking curvilinear lines that makes the Queen Anne design so important and so successful, really. And that design came to Wethersfield from Boston. And as Arthur said, we have this Queen Anne walnut veneer highboy that we discussed last Saturday that shows an earlier kind of basis of that Queen Anne design, but it's clearly reflected as it transferred from Boston to Wethersfield. We do think that the Queen Anne design was brought from Boston to Wethersfield by a cabinet maker named William Manley. And he arrived in Wethersfield about 1735 to 1742. And he brought with him a simplified, similar style design highboy. No, there's no carved shells, and there's drawer arrangement, a split top drawer over the long graduated drawers, and the apron with the box drawers on the side, and this high arch center is similar to the earliest Wethersfield highboys made by William Manley. They didn't have this Cupid's bow in the center. They generally were more simplified, simple arch, seam a curved C in the center, and then flanked by these other extended panels on the side, sometimes a curve, a reversing C curve or S curve on the side. And that was the design that William Manley brought, and that really influenced a lot in Wethersfield. But we can see how this design, and especially these curves flanking the pendant drop, how that relates directly to the Wethersfield highboy that we have here. But there is a simplicity to this Boston piece and more of a straightness of the leg, because this piece was really transitioning from the William and Mary period, where they had a lot of emphasis on veneered and veneered surfaces, into the Queen Anne. When we look at the construction, we can see that the drawer is run on a medial drawer runner, and that's a center drawer runner that runs right through the center and supports from below. And actually on this drawer bottom, you can see this stripe in the center. That's the wear from the medial drawer runner going right through the center of the drawer. So that was more used in William and Mary period furniture. And then by the Queen Anne period, they went to the side drawer runners, which we find on the Wethersfield highboy. But with this sophistication of this highboy, it really was something similar to what William Manley would have learned to build, and was the really cutting edge in the 1730s in Boston. The Queen Anne style was just arriving into America.
So when Kevin introduced the idea of the basic element of the cabriole is the C, the C scroll. So if you use the letter C, right, or you can reverse it, right? But if you take them back to back, you have two of them, you have an S. Okay, you have it this way, you have it this way, you can have it any way you want. And so what do we see? We see an S right here, which is basically two C's back to back. And you see it right here. And it flows all the way. It is the basic tenet of Queen Anne. So here we are in Boston, 1730 period. And then we move 30 years later, possibly 25, 30 years later to Wethersfield. And we see the same thing, the S and the C. And it became extremely, it's a very graceful design. And then if you really stretch it out, you get a scroll leg, a cabriole leg, because here is the C. And then if you follow it down, you have to use your imagination. But here it is the C and the S in reverse. And that is the basic idea of the Queen Anne style. Eventually, people said, okay, that's enough of that. Enough of the graceful period. And that's when Chippendale, sort of Thomas Chippendale in England, introduced the idea of more graphic, more linear designs. But this basic tenet of the S and the C lasted around a long time. Because first of all, it took a while for it to arrive in the colonies. If this was being done in England in 1715, 1720, it didn't get here until say 1740, 1745. And so it lasted pretty much out here, even into the country around 1770, even late as 1780 sometime, before the new Chippendale design sort of took hold. But Wethersfield, being on the Connecticut River, the center of transportation, the website, the new internet, was being passed around, and the new ideas of communication was introducing all these new designs. That's why Wethersfield, Newington, Springfield, the whole area along the Connecticut River, where transportation was so advanced as compared to out in the country of, say, Connecticut and Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. It was always the coastal areas and along the rivers where transportation brought communication, communication brought more ideas, and it spread quickly.
Then I'll just back up a little bit towards the beginning of the Queen Anne form. And this is a really important highboy that I'll see if I can share with you guys. And this is the Porter Belden highboy that's in the Brooklyn Museum of Art. Oh, it looks like we might have lost screen for a second. Hold on there. Somebody screen sharing. Oh, someone's screen sharing there, please. You could stop screen sharing.
Not me.
Okay, hold on. Please stand by while we try to get back to. All right, here we are. All right, thank you. Always got to have a little bit of a gremlin. So this is the Porter Belden highboy, and this is made in 1753 at the marriage of Abigail Porter and Thomas Belden in Wethersfield. And this really shows that development from the William Manley School with this serpentine apron into what would really become the meat and potatoes of the Wethersfield School. And we can see that design with the double carved shell in the top case, one shell on the top and one shell on the bottom, and particularly a very distinctive Wethersfield design, which is those two small drawers flanking the shell on the top. And where that came from and how it developed from the William Manley split top drawer of his design into this very Wethersfield two small drawers flanking the fan drawers, we don't know. And we don't know who made the Porter Belden highboy. But we do know that a gentleman named Return Belden was an apprentice of William Manley. He had died by the time this highboy was made in 1753. But it's a really important highboy and really shows that great quality of Wethersfield furniture. And when we compare that to the highboy in Newington, made for the Kellogg family, we can really see a difference and another additional progression of design and style, particularly in the apron, where you lose that classic kind of downtown Wethersfield serpentine, graceful S-curves of the apron, and this more compact, but really visually exciting scroll work of this three-part or tripartite apron.
So I think at this point, we're gonna sort of dismantle the highboy a little bit and show you the inner workings. But before we start, the wood is cherry. Cherry is truly an amazing wood. It was native to Connecticut. It was only about 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, that I saw my first cherry tree. Because out in the woods, there are no longer any cherry trees. And I always felt that maybe these trees were actually called cherry because the wood tends to be very red when it's cut fresh. Well, I happen to be in Madison, Connecticut on a rainy, miserable, cold, frigid day in February or March of the year. And I went to see my friend Kurt Crump, who was a terrific clock repair person in Madison, Connecticut. And I was bringing him a clock to be put in order. And when I got to the driveway, a gentleman came out of the woods soaking wet and he said, "You own this place?" And I said, no, but my friend does, and he's inside. Well, he said, I'm a woodsman. I've done it all my life. He said, out in the woods here is the biggest cherry tree I ever saw. And I said, really? And I said, can I go see it? Yeah, he said, but you ought to get the guy who owns the property. He said, I'm clearing land here for new development. And he said, I hate to cut this tree down, but it's in the way. So I went and got Kurt, and we went out, and he showed us the trunk of this enormous tree. And he said, this is, in all my years, this is the biggest cherry tree I ever saw. And I said, why are they called cherries? He said, because they have little cherries. And I said, they literally have little cherries? He said, yep, about the size of, he said, not like the cherries that we know today, they're even smaller. And he said, the wood is red. And they were prolific in the 18th and 19th century. But the cabinet makers and the house builders, mostly the cabinet makers, performed genocide on this species because everybody wanted cherry. And they didn't plan ahead. They didn't replant. They just went around and cut. And so the wood is gorgeous. I mean, it really is amazing. It's clear, very few knots, and it's quite strong. Not as strong maybe as maple or birch, but cherry is very strong in its own right. And Connecticut, certain areas of Pennsylvania, and certain areas of upstate New York. There's actually an area in upstate New York called Cherry Valley, which still today there are cherry trees growing in Cherry Valley, but I don't think they're quite as, I recently spoke to somebody and they said they're not as big as they grew in the 18th century. We know that. So anyway, so the cabinet makers used cherry because it competed for price. They didn't have to import mahogany. It was cheaper and more available in this particular area than walnut. And so that was the cabinet maker's first choice in Connecticut and the area around here. So the wood of Wethersfield and Newington, they belong to Connecticut Valley. They really wanted to use this cherry because it competed for value, it competed for beauty, and it competed for strength. So we'll start to pull it apart, pull out the drawers.
Yep, here's the big fan drawer again, and really shows that great quality of Wethersfield construction. They have nicely cut dovetails on the front and the back. There we go. And, you know, not too concerned with the details of those dovetails in the front. They're kind of large and seem a little bit oddly spaced, but they did the trick and they were, you know, making a good quality piece. A nice thick secondary wood on the side. The drawer sides are slightly rounded. And the drawer backs, you can even see the plane marks from the finish little draw plane that they use to finish the back. And one interesting thing about Wethersfield furniture, for some reason, they weren't all that concerned about how they finished the secondary woods. So you often see plane marks or saw marks on the secondary wood. So they were very concerned with how the primary wood was finished. So the fan carving on the front, again, really symmetrical, really well done, beautifully planed across the front, beautifully crafted thumb molded edge. But even on the inside of the drawer sides, let's see if I can get the raking light right. But here there's a little bit of a rough patch. I can't, well, maybe that's a little bit, you can see it's there. That's the remnants of an up and down saw mark from the sawmill. So they didn't even really plane all the saw marks off of this section of the drawer. I think even the bottom of the drawer, and very classic of Wethersfield, the drawer bottoms often show the remnants of saw marks. And here you can see some of that back and forth, those horizontal lines. That's from the up and down pit saw marks from when the planks were being crafted, and that was not even cleared off by the cabinet maker as he finished the piece. And I always wondered about the pit saw, and that would be one gentleman or apprentice down in the pit and one apprentice or sawyer up on the top, and they would pull the saw vertically up and down. And I guess the guy down in the bottom of the pit had the hard job as all the sawdust and shavings fell down on his head. But you can also notice on this drawer bottom, a real thickness. You know, they really had a lot of wood and great quality wood. So they use a full thickness to the drawer bottom and then chamfer it on the sides where it intersected with the drawer sides. And that really thick and hardy Weathersfield construction is really typical and an indication of the high quality and this great preservation. And we see this in pieces that descended down in families. These are the original rosehead nails, and just never been disturbed. Even has a little bit of the bluing from the forge where the nail was hand wrought. Real great classic quality. And when you look at the drawer sides, you notice there's barely any wear on the drawer side where it was running on the top drawer.
So since Kevin is holding that, we are going to compare a little bit of the Boston school to the Weathersfield school of the Boston being 1730-ish, the veneered one. Wood was so important in Boston by that time that they started to imitate the English style by making the draw sides really thin and conserving wood the best that they could, so they could build another highboy. But in Weathersfield in Connecticut, where the wood was plentiful, the wood is thicker, and even the draw bottoms, which Kevin just showed you how thick the bottom is on this particular Weathersfield school highboy in Boston, it's really thin. And so they were trying to conserve and be frugal with the wood as much as they could. And, you know, last week we told the fact that wood was more critical at the time, according to some historians, more important of trying to stay warm and build ships and houses than building highboys. And so the wood became really thin in Boston, but in Weathersfield and in Connecticut, out in the country, the wood was so prevalent that they didn't have to scrimp quite so much. And this is a really perfect example. The veneered highboy is actually veneered on eastern white pine. Really inexpensive wood because the woods were full of white pine, whereas even the cherry in the 18th century, even though it was plentiful, was revered. And so it was honored and only became very popular as furniture.
And one thing about this walnut highboy too, is that you can see the quality of the Boston cabinet makers as they're going a little bit extra to make a double arch molding on the drawer sides and the drawer backs. And that's just a little bit of that kind of urban sophistication that makes Boston work stand out. In Weathersfield, they just slightly rounded the drawer sides, and this drawer back is pretty roughly cut. So that's something that you would see more typically in a Boston school or an urban piece, an attention to the tops of the drawer sides than you would see in a Connecticut or Weathersfield piece where you have just a simple rounded edge to the drawer sides.
So we'll dismantle the Weathersfield highboy and give you an idea. The draw bottoms in Connecticut were one big piece, and they used white pine, it's used to a poplar wood. They use a variation of secondary wood, keeping the cherry only for the draw fronts, the sides, the legs, the primary wood, the show color, the show wood. Many times it's called.
And again, this drawer bottom, the grain runs from side to side. So we tilt it towards the camera again. So the grain is running from me to Arthur, back and forth, and that's the main grain of the board. It's applied along the back edge with nails and just set into the front edge. And we'll compare it to the Boston piece, which has a different technique for the drawer bottom. Again, you'll see, I'll bring it up to the camera. You can see the rough cut of the saw marks on the Weathersfield School Highboy drawer bottoms. You can kind of see some of those saw marks.
And to conserve the eastern white pine, the cabinet makers in Boston started to use the English technique of front to back and smaller pieces of wood, because they just didn't have the full width. And so I know that we discussed this last Saturday, but it's still a great lesson, because you see, look at the shrinkage caused by 250, 300 years of shrinkage, and that green wood, when it was first cut, look at, you can actually drop your money down and go from drawer to drawer. Yeah.
And so this drawer bottom is actually, I think, 3 pieces, if I'm seeing it right. There's a seam about here. Yeah, there's one seam here, and one seam over at the edge. Yep, so it's 3 pieces, and this shrinkage crack is not at the glue seam, because the glue seam will be stronger than the more open grain of the pine. So it split where it was weakest, and that was not at the glue joint.
There it is again, consistency of technique from top to bottom, using the front to back, shaving on the big pieces of wood.
And you'll notice there's no saw marks or pit saw marks on the bottom of this Boston Highboy. It's very smoothly finished and very planed off very well.
There we are back again with the Connecticut Valley, where wood was so plentiful. They said, oh, we have big pieces of wood, let's just use one big board at the bottom. They didn't have to use multiple pieces front to back. They used one big one. And so even though Connecticut Hartford School is only about 75 miles, 100 miles to Boston, it was a huge difference by then. 1750, Boston was well established. They had been living in Boston for 100 years already. Connecticut was still the hinterlands. And so they did not go through, they didn't build ships as much. They didn't build houses as much. They didn't build furniture as much. So they still had a lot of wood, and they were very sort of not so cautious with wasting it. Show you to see show you how consistent it is from top to bottom. And this is what we do when we examine a piece for originality, authenticity. We look for consistency from top to bottom. So we're gonna speed it up a little bit so that we can turn the bottom section of the highboy upside down, so you can see how the legs were made from the inside. It's truly fascinating, actually. Don't forget, 1,600 pounds per leg is pretty remarkable engineering.
And as we get this top piece, we'll try to bring it towards the camera and show that inside this upper case, there's a full-length dust board. And that gives support to these small drawers. And that's why these small drawers don't have they don't use the medial drawer runners. And actually the case uses the side drawer runners, but this full-length dust board in the case is an important weatherspoon feature.
I want to introduce one idea here. I've done this over 50 years. Kevin has done this over 20 years. I was taller than he when I started, but I'm carrying lots of high boys. He's not taller.
But I am shrinking. So yeah, turn it a little bit towards the light and then try to tilt it. No, go backwards toward that. Oh. Just that little bit, if we can show a little bit of that. Dust board.
Oh, okay. We could do it.
Oh.
Okay, so what we're gonna do is, we're actually gonna set. Now, one of the joys of looking at this is the color. The color of the whole interior section here is open to the air. Some people call it oxidation. I don't really know. Some people don't like that term. Some people say it has nothing to do with oxidation, but it's actually the coloring of the wood open to the air. And so.
And that's important when you're looking at all the different elements of the drawer bottoms, these drawer runners, these are the side drawer runners that go from the front of the case to the back. And you know, all these elements are important when understanding the condition and quality, the color of the backboard. This piece is lived together for 200 years, all these different elements. So you want it to have the same color and the same style. So one thing we can compare, which I think is always interesting, is the drawer bottom from the top section and the drawer bottom from the bottom section. So here's the two drawer bottoms. One there. All right. So this is the drawer bottom from the top section that shows that lightness where it's sealed into the case. And the drawer bottom from the bottom section that shows that oxidation or just the age and patina of being exposed to the elements in the air and the soot and all that from being in the open area of the bottom case. So these are made exactly at the same time, the same wood, but just that being exposed to air. And really that color that you see on this drawer of that rosy red, warm brown color is such an important color to understand and study, get to know, because this wood, after all this age, has a certain really distinct color. And if this was a replaced drawer bottom, someone might try to stain that or artificially color it, but you can never quite get that same kind of rosy, warm brown color that you can with real natural oxidation.
By the way, if anybody has any questions, you are welcome to go into chat and Ellen, Sarah is standing by to answer any, or at least introduce your questions. So please ask questions. You're more than welcome. And then as we go inside, you can see how the color changes as we take the drawers out. But the fascinating part is to see the changing color of the legs, because as you heard already, this is one piece of wood that goes all the way up. So as it's exposed out here, it's darker than up inside where it's not exposed to the air. So it's a great lesson to see it. And this is where we really love to see the real proof of the pudding. That's why when you see dealers, collectors, museum people tearing things apart, we've been called termites, but we're actually not just termites. We're actually looking to see the authenticity, the proof of the pudding. So there it is. So we're not going to put it back together again. All you have to do is put your video in reverse and you can see it, how we did it. But we do this all the time. It's the fun of the business, there's no question about it. Going through and examining the forensics of what we find. One of these days, maybe we'll do a program on only the forensics, the funny things that we find along the way, to be able to prove the age and the authenticity. But this is the real joy of this, besides the form of this highboy. And by the way, that is the first thing that our firm, Nathan Liverant, said, we go firmly by the form of what the piece is first. If it has great form, then we go further. If it doesn't have good form, it doesn't matter to us how original it is. It's got to have a really good design, and that is the most important part to us. But then when you are lucky to have great form and great condition, and then you have the frosting of the original owners, that is like the joy. I mean, that is really, truly amazing to know what the folks actually look like. And so if there's any questions.
If there's any questions, you can unmute and ask your question directly, or you can ask in the chat and we'll answer that way. So. It's Q&A time.
Did they use any kinds of glues? If so, what did they use for a glue?
Glue. What did they, Larry?
Good, very good question. The question is what kind of glue was used? And I will add that it's still glue that we use today. When we have,
yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Our cabinet makers who work with us. It's hide glue, animal glue, fish glue, but what it does is it is not the modern glues that are way too stiff and do not allow expansion and contraction. The hide glues, which are used, and animal glues, which have been used for thousands of years, still is the best glue because it is reversible. It expands and contracts with humidity, with temperature, and it also, believe it or not, will be reversible with warm water. All you have to do is put warm water compress on the joint, and that leg will come up, the joint will come apart very easily without stressing or creating cracks. And so, but it will stand the test of time. And we have seen pieces that are 300.
Thank you, dear. You know, I think you're the best.
You gonna make me blush.
Oh, right.
A couple questions.
Is there?
I think you also mentioned to me, Art, never use Gorilla Glue on a piece of furniture. They're
Never.
No.
It's either hide glue or animal glue for us or nothing at all. Because really, modern glues can do more damage than nothing at all. Okay, another question.
Good question. We often see the upper and lower drawers pulled out to show the dovetailing similarities. Are you looking for them to match? Can you show us what specifically is a knee return? Great program, thank you.
Okay, so yes. In probably my time of being in the field, I can honestly say that I've only actually seen a top and bottom of the same piece where the dovetails do not match, and it can be proven maybe by the theory that maybe two different apprentices in the same shop made dovetails. It is a very tough argument. However, there are always extenuating circumstances. For instance, the primary wood has to match in quality. The quality of the secondary wood has to match quality in thickness, because the master of a shop was not going to let two apprentices go off and do whatever they want and not maintain the order and the quality of his shop. In Connecticut, we had a cabinet maker who had a big shop by the name of Liverant Chapin. The guy must have been so extreme that everything, and that's one of the reasons why he has such a great name, everything is always done within a certain parameter. Otherwise, we never find his work or something that came out that we think came out of his shop that did not follow the exact order of which he wanted. And so Kevin has set up two drawers for you showing the same dovetails, both front and back, the same thickness of wood, top and bottom. And so and the quality of the wood has to match. So there's always a lot of parameters what we go with besides just dovetails.
And more important too, or also important in the dovetails is the shape of the dovetails. Because they may not have the same number, and this top fan drawer and the bottom fan drawer are slightly different sizes. So the top fan drawer has kind of a different dovetail arrangement than the bottom fan drawer, but they're the same exact depth, and they're the same arrangement to the dovetails, and that the angle of the side and the depth is about the same. And something that's important is where the top kind of half dovetail and the bottom of the drawer, whether it has also another half dovetail or no dovetail. So there's different combinations that can occur, but as long as that's consistent from the top and the bottom, and like this piece has a nice big half dovetail on the top, nice big half dovetail on the top here. The drawer sides are both rounded in the same manner, and the bottom of both drawers have no dovetails as well. It just ends in a flat, open piece of side secondary wood. So that shape of each dovetail is very important. And Weathersfield is kind of known for these kind of almost clumsy, wide dovetails without a lot of angle, kind of flat in their design.
Most shops had little idiosyncrasies that were consistent to that particular shop. And the more we learn, the more we learn. And so we look for these little idiosyncrasies. But in 1974, the Lyman Allen Museum in New London did a study on New London County furniture. Edgar Mayhew was director of the museum, and Minor Meyer, who was a history professor at Hunt College, they wrote the history of New London County furniture, and they actually proved to us pretty well that New London County had certain quality of dovetails different, certain angles. And at first, a lot of people thought that that was not true. But I think over the long term, since 1974, almost 50 years, they have proven that that theory that they came up with has a lot of substance and a lot of truth to it.
Before we go on, there was a question about the knee return. Yeah. So can we put that up, or you want to put it on top?
Sure.
Can I ask a question?
You want to hold that for a minute?
Can I ask a question? Gigi,
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
this is Tim Smith.
Hi, Tim.
How are you? And I want to thank you for sitting there for all this time. I want to ask a question, and Kevin knows where it's coming from. You study the Hartford and Connecticut River Valley, but of course there's Housatonic and Stratfield and other types of high boys that are around and available. And I'm asking if their quality is inferior to the Hartford material or Boston or whatever, or maybe more idiosyncratic than what you've all been talking about.
Okay, while Kevin is,
Before we go on to Tim's question, let's answer the first question.
okay,
About knee returns. We'll get to that, Tim, and that's a great question. Thank you. But the knee return, what we refer to on these high boys, is here on the lowercase flanking the legs. I'll see if we'll get you to zoom in for us. But you have the tall cabriole leg as one piece. And to create a transition and give an extra little curve of a line, there's these applied little triangular blocks called the knee returns. And that knee return, in this case, has a beautiful S curve to it and is actually chamfered on the inside. So that knee return, that little applied block, is a really important visual element that helps to transition from the leg to the apron. And it's curved, facing outwards, and that convex, and so it kind of goes in multiple directions. And a lot of these knee returns were also very specific to a regional characteristic as well as a workshop characteristic. And what Tim was asking about was regional characteristics. And we're really fond of our regional characteristics here at Nathan Liverant's. In a way, I think part of it is just your different tastes. Some people like Mercedes Benzes and some people like Audis or BMWs. You know, they're all nice, but what's your personal taste? We're very attached to the regional designs that came in Eastern Connecticut. I think most people will say that Wethersfield have a certain quality of regional design, and they stayed pretty much within their world of Wethersfield design. Different areas like New London County or Woodbury on the other side of the river, they tended to experiment a little bit more and have very kind of dramatic, different designs from one workshop to the next workshop. So Wethersfield, they tended to stay pretty focused. And actually this Kellogg High Boy with this particular design of the apron is unusual because it's not your classic Wethersfield S curves and Cupid's bow. This three-part apron is something a little bit different, and that helps support the origin outside of Wethersfield, maybe in Newington.
and on the Boston High Boy, the knee bracket is simple compared to the more sort of sophisticated one of the Wethersfield school. There again, the production model of the Boston school, they were probably a little more concerned about knocking out pieces. They had the draw fronts of veneer, but the rest of the piece They had production, probably apprentices working, and it was simple to make a little simple knee bracket as compared to the one in the Connecticut Valley. Sarah?
We have another question, and somebody's attention was drawn to the high boy on the back wall. And the question is, why is that so dark in color? Is it because of the dark stain? Was the stain used on that particular high boy?
Okay, that high boy, which is on our backstage, is actually figured maple. We call it figured maple, and that is because when figured maple or any kind of maple was originally cut, it was very light in color. And so a lot of the cabinet makers would use some kind of a wash many times to tone down the wood. Well, in this particular case, styles change. And it probably had a surface originally to put on to sort of tone down the rawness of the fresh cut wood. However, as styles change, if this piece was made in New Hampshire, we know the family history. We're not going to get into that now, but it eventually, probably around 1850 to 1870, it became a little more stylish to have your piece of furniture rather look like maple, country maple. Maybe it was better to have it look more like walnut or mahogany. So somebody might have in 1820, 1840, decided to darken their high boy. We don't think this is original surface. That is a very difficult surface to determine in many cases. This one is, I don't know how anybody could actually figure out how old this surface is. It's old, it's early, but we don't know exactly how old. It could be the original, we don't know. We don't necessarily want to say until we can really be certain. And I don't know if even the new science, new technology would be able to determine that that well. But I will say this, it has a great surface, a great feel, and a great color to it. So it is a little darker than usual, but that's part of why I like it so much. It's not real classic typical.
Yeah, and I think, through that, the modern technologies of infrared microscopy, you can determine what the materials that the surfaces are made out of using infrared and fluorescence under a microscope to determine. But for us, that's not all that important because the quality of the surface is so rich. So in a way, it is what it is. And when you look closely, if you could look even closer on this, there's a crackler to the surface too, that shows a real age and a real integrity to this surface. That's really just beautiful quality. And so you can see in certain, as I get it to certain lights, it looks pretty dark. And then when I get it into a raking light, you can see through that surface and see some of the maple below. And that's really the beauty of an old, and what I like to call a historic surface. So this is a historic surface that has a lot of character to it. That really shows well.
Sure. Yeah.
That's what I got from you.
Did you answer my question?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, sir. Did you answer my question about the regionality of the Connecticut high
Okay.
boys?
Right, so there are,
Right.
right now, there are, I think, 6 or 8 counties in Connecticut. There are several different counties in Rhode Island. And there are certain counties in Massachusetts, in the lower part of
Yes.
New England. Okay, so in 1740, 1750, those states that I just mentioned, New London County did not want to be confused with Litchfield County. Litchfield County did not want to be confused with Hartford County. Hartford County certainly didn't want to be compared to Fairfield County. Nobody wanted to be compared to Newport, Rhode Island. And so these little areas became little countries. And everybody had what Kevin said before, what we call regional characteristics. And that's how we can pinpoint Not always, but we can certainly, many times, as we know New England furniture pretty well, what counties a lot of these pieces came from by dissecting the form, the quality of the wood, the type of wood, the type of nails. Litchfield, Connecticut had more nails than any other county because they had iron ore. There's a little highboard, a little chest of drawer that we have in the shop right now. A little 4-drawer bureau has more wrought iron nails than any other piece that we have on the floor. They had iron ore, and so they made nails, and lots of them, and they were cheap. So all these became what we call regional characteristics. It's a really good question. It takes a lot of study, but it's really fun to figure out just by going by counties. And by the Revolution and after we beat England back to their own game, by 1800, a lot of these regional characteristics started to disappear, because we became homogenized to a certain respect. We became really proud, and we became one country. So I hope, does that answer the question a little bit?
Yes, thank you, sir. You're excellent. And we like Kevin so much.
So do we.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
Ah,
All right, thanks for attending, everyone. And I would just say in closing, visit our website, liverantantiques.com. Go to the shows and events page, and we have a whole list of events and special opportunities here at the shop for the time when we would have been at the Winter Antique Show. You can join us, and then on Saturday, January 29th from 2 o'clock to say 3 o'clock or so, we're going to have another Zoom forum where we'll be talking about some aspect of American antiques. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
No more questions.
No more questions. All right,
Bye.
good night.